Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Natural Selection Podcast. Your host today is myself, Tristan Herbert, and today I will be speaking with Tim Gordon, a marine biologist at the University of Exeter. This episode will explore an important and often overlooked challenge in conservation, focusing on the conservationists themselves. In their day-to-day work, they are frequently witness to the deterioration of wildlife, extinction of species, and even the collapse of whole ecosystems, all the while knowing how these changes do and will affect all of us. To raise awareness about this, Tim Gordon co-wrote a letter into the journal Science, entitled "Grieving Environmental Scientists Need Support." In this episode, we therefore explore these issues and discover how conservationists can address and overcome their grief to emerge stronger, more resilient, and more able to enact the changes we need. Hi Tim, thank you very much for joining us for this episode of the Natural Selection Podcast. To start off with, I'd like to ask if you could please describe a bit about your career, and if there was a particular event that first made you think about this issue.
Sure. I am currently doing a PhD in Exeter, joint with some institutes in Australia on coral reef ecology. So I started that PhD in 2016. The first time I went to the Great Barrier Reef where I work was at the start of that PhD. And it was quite a shocking experience in some ways, in that I had imagined all this time growing up, studying biosciences at university and, going down the path of a career in ecosystem research. I had imagined that would be an experience of marveling at the astonishing diversity and spectacle that the Great Barrier Reef is. And in fact, when we got there for the first time, we arrived in the wake of one of the most severe bleaching events in history. And what we found was this sort of post-apocalyptic rubble field. It was a real shock to the system.
I can imagine that must have been really tough. And I think it shows the falseness of the assumption that scientists and researchers are purely dispassionate observers of the natural world. So, acknowledging that conservationists are emotionally affected by their work, do you think that there's a way to transition from those initial feelings of grief and despair to something more positive or something more constructive?
I think one of the most important things is to recognize that those feelings of grief are inherently positive and are inherently constructive, in that they are a normal response to what we're seeing. I think there's this sort of weird disconnect, or can be anyway, in some circles, this weird assumption that because you're a scientist, you're not allowed to have an emotional response to what you work on. It's inappropriate and it's dangerous, and you're better to just, it would be good if you could just be a mindless drone and not respond to anything you see and just collect data, because then your data will only then be truly objective. You know what I mean? And in some ways that's quite dangerous, because what we understand about grief from psychology and grief in other walks of life is that it's mentally very powerful, almost sort of temporarily handicapping in a way, in that when somebody is grieving, it limits their creativity, it limits the way that they can think straight, it limits their perceptions of the future and the possibilities that the future holds. And those are all traits that we don't want in our environmental scientists today, I don't think. We want people who are able to think creatively about the future, who are able to sort of see beyond the sad, devastating, grief-stricken moments of today into a way that we could make the future of the natural world better tomorrow. And in order to do that, you have to address the grief. You can't do that if you're still wrapped up in a turmoil, being devastated about what you've just seen. So I think we need, as a scientific community, to be able to be open, to be able to share experiences of grief, and to be able to acknowledge that this is something that we go through. It's something that, unfortunately, we can expect to go through. And it's something that we need to learn to help each other get through, so that we can function better as both as individual scientists and as a group of researchers working together.
I completely agree. So, for young conservationists out there, do you have any advice you might give them if they are currently feeling grief or despair?
Yeah, I think I'm not an expert, is the first thing to say. None of our research group are experts. We wrote this letter because we felt it wasn't being discussed enough, and we wanted to raise it as an issue as opposed to saying we had solutions. So different things will help different people. What we have found as a research group helps us is firstly just to acknowledge it communally, that actually knowing that this is something that we go through together and that is a normal response is really helpful for all of us, rather than imagining ourselves as weird or isolated in this. And that allows us to talk about it and to explore different ways that we all experience grief and different ways that we all deal with grief, and that can be helpful. Another thing worth mentioning is that there is professional help available. There are lots of outlets for counselling, there's good stuff online, and that can be useful for some people in some cases. And then finally, some of us have found that working out what you're going to do with the grief, working out where you're going to channel it, and how you're going to use it as motivation for some positive action moving forward can be a very helpful response.
Fantastic. Do you think also that universities could put in place strategies to ensure that conservationists have the support that they need?
Yeah, absolutely. Institutional support, I think, is probably important, as well as personal support networks. And one idea that we wonder about is actually whether there is something to be learned from other professions in which dealing with grief is commonplace. So things like disaster relief, the military, medicine, poverty relief, all of these sorts of careers are places where people in a professional context are really used to coming up against things that are really emotionally difficult. And for the sake of their work and for the sake of themselves, they have to get through it. And so I wonder if there's stuff we can learn from those industries as well.
That really makes sense. So to learn from other fields and harness other expertise. Is there also a sense, though, that in conservation specifically, it's important to be both optimistic but also realistic? I'm just wondering if there's somehow a balance to be struck between the two.
I guess you could call it a balance. For me, the important thing is, what are we placing our hope and our optimism in? Because hope and optimism are clearly important, but it's also important that they're not blind hope and optimism. We're not being optimistic for the sake of being optimistic, where there's actually no grounds for that. So in my research on coral reefs, I think there are some hard truths that have to be accepted, that many of the reefs worldwide that we know and love either have been damaged already to the extent where they will never fully recover, or are very likely to go through that process in the next few years. And that's really tough to deal with. But rather than holding out a sort of blind optimism that maybe it won't happen, or maybe they'll go back to exactly how they were and everything will be back to how it was nicely 20 years ago, maybe the place for optimism there is actually that there will be the possibility for different ecosystems to emerge. And, it's not the case that because what we know as a coral reef today has been degraded, there will be nothing of value left tomorrow. Many species will still survive. Many different species configurations are still possible. And whilst those won't be the same as what we know as a tropical coral reef today, they will still have beauty and inherent value and will still be worth protecting. And maybe that's what we need to get motivated about. So I think it's where you put your optimism is probably the important thing.
That's super inspiring. And I get the feeling that in both terrestrial and marine realms, there has been a shift away from a purely protectionist approach to a more forward-thinking outlook that asks how ecosystems can be made more resilient for the future.
Yeah, I think we're all learning as a global community of researchers and conservationists that there are many different solutions, and that each solution has its place and has its strengths and has its limitations. So, for instance, in the marine world, marine protected areas are a huge mechanism of conservation that's been used for many years. And in some places and in some cases, they are still very important and working very well to achieve some conservation goals. In other places and cases, they don't do a whole lot. Now, marine protected area doesn't protect you from coral bleaching. And so, perhaps there's a need to incorporate what we already know and existing techniques with new techniques, new ways of protecting ecosystems, new ways of restoring and rebuilding ecosystems, and trying to integrate all of these different tools in a way that accepts the strengths and limitations of each one.
Yes. So thinking about new techniques, I believe your current coral reef research is looking into an idea called acoustic enrichment.
Yeah, so this is, I guess, an example of a potentially new tool for reef restoration that we are investigating and developing. So it stems from having seen the extensive destruction on the barrier reef. One of the things we noticed and were concerned about was that the soundscape had completely changed. So that this combination of different sounds that you can hear on a reef, the snapping shrimp clicks, the whoops and the grunts and the trills made by fish, usually create this very loud natural soundscape on a coral reef, and many animals use that soundscape to find the coral reef and choose it as home. So in a range of experiments we did, we were concerned that the new degraded, quieter soundscapes were actually less attractive to settlement stage organisms and would attract fewer fish and invertebrates back to them. So one obvious reversal of that is that on a small scale, it might be possible to use loudspeakers to play the sounds of healthy ecosystems in places that you're trying to regenerate in order to try and create a boost in attraction, a boost in settlement, and accelerate the early stages of that recovery.
That's really awesome. Now, as my last question, I just wanted to ask, thinking again about the letter you co-wrote into the journal Science, what was the reaction to that letter? Did you have many people writing in who had really felt accord with what you'd written?
Yeah, we did. It was overwhelmingly positive and really encouraging, actually, in a way that we didn't expect. Many people wrote to us, tweeted us, emailed us, spoke to us, and some of those people were people we knew and that we'd worked with for a long time, and others were people who we'd never met before. And some of them were academics, but equally there were people working in NGOs, people working in the media, covering stories on ecology and conservation. And all of these people were writing us to thank us for publishing it and to say that it had given them a real sense of freedom almost, and a real sense of relief to read in print that this was a common feeling, that people were going through this, and it sort of created a sense in them that actually it was okay and it was normal. So that was something that we were really encouraged by, almost bowled over by, in that in some ways, it proved that the concept of the letter was important.
Fantastic. And I definitely felt strong accord with it personally, and would urge anyone who has identified with this to check it out also. So I would just like to say thank you very much, Tim, for your time today. It's been really brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed this episode. For anyone interested in reading the letter, the link is in the description. Please tune in next time as we interview Dr. Madeleine Gumas and her very interesting new insights into the behaviour of that infamous seaside food thief, the herring gull.